So today we're going to be in the Gospel according to Luke. We're going to start with chapter 15. So we're going to be in Luke for all of our time together. So Luke chapter 15 verse 1. And today I brought a different map for you guys to look at. I don't know if you can see it on the video or not, but this is going to show up some different regions. Like I said, the map says Palestine and Greco-Roman times. These are Roman districts that Rome set up to kind of break up the region of Palestine. So today, Jesus is going to be around this area over here. It's called Perea. Okay? So you got Galilee, Samaria, Judea, Idumea, Perea, and you can't see it on here, but the Decapolis is over here. So it'll help you if you know a little bit about the geography of it. You'll be surprised how much that will help you understand your Bible. If you know where things are happening and where they're taking place at. So here we got parable of the lost sheep. In Luke chapter 15, these first three parables, Jesus is going to teach us about the joy over finding something that was lost. So we're going to see the parable of the lost sheep, parable of the lost coin, and then the parable of the lost son. Remember, we're in Luke's gospel, we're in the travel narrative or the travel account where Jesus is heading towards Jerusalem for the last time. So during this time, crowds, just like in his ministry before, crowds were following him around. So people were walking around with him, people were listening to him teach and things like that. So here we see in chapter 15, verse 1, some tax collectors and some experts in the law, they get aggravated with Jesus because he's hanging out with sinners and tax collectors. So they're muttering under their breath. Jesus knows what they're talking about, so he's going to address that issue. And that's what these three parables here that we're fixing to talk about, that's what is addressed here. So if we keep that in mind, it'll help us understand the parable. So they're muttering about it. Then Jesus tells them a parable. He says, suppose one of you has 100 sheep and loses one of them. Does he not leave the 99 in the open country and go after the lost sheep until he finds it? And when he finds it, he joyfully puts it on his shoulders and goes home. Then he calls his friends and neighbors together and says, rejoice with me, I have found my lost sheep. I tell you that in the same way there will be more rejoicing in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous persons who do not need to repent. And these first two stories we'll see, the point of this is he's trying to stress to the Pharisees and the tax collectors the reason why he's doing what he's doing. So elsewhere Jesus teaches that he came to seek and save that which was lost. He came after sinners. That's why he came into the world. And that's what he's doing here. And he's trying to explain to these Pharisees and tax collectors the reason why he hangs out with sinners, because he's calling them to himself. And likewise, with the next parable, it's the parable of the lost coin. He tells us about a woman that has 10 coins and she loses one, and then she sweeps the house, lights the lamps, and searches for this lost coin. And when she finds the coin, she calls her neighbors and she rejoices over finding the lost coin. So both of these have to do with finding that which was lost. And notice too, these first two parables, they tell us, or the emphasis in the parable is going to be over joy, over finding that which was lost. And Jesus tells them the spiritual aspect of it, that the joy is not necessarily on an earthly plane. He's telling you joy that's happening in heaven. These angels are rejoicing over the people that are turning to God, that are repenting. Secondary aspect of both of these parables is it's the shepherd that seeks after the lost sheep, and it's the lady that loses the coin that goes after, that finds the coin. The sheep doesn't find itself, and the coin doesn't find itself. There's the initial seeking comes from the shepherd, and it comes from the lady who lost the coin. Same way with Jesus preaching. That's what he's doing. He's going after that which was lost. So the implication in both of these parables is the sheep is not going to find its way home, and the coin is not going to find its way back in this lady's pocket without some kind of initiative from the person that lost it. So what Jesus is telling us here. So both of these have to do with rejoicing over that, finding something that was lost. And then we get into the parable of the lost son. Those two parables are simple. And one thing and we'll get into the parable of the lost son. This is Luke chapter 15, verse 11. This is also the point of the story, is finding, having joy in finding that which was lost. And this parable is a good parable for us to see that when you look at these parables, context is always the key. So remember, when you take this parable, the parable of the lost son or the parable of the prodigal son, you see that you got to go back in and put it in context. Why is Jesus teaching this parable? Well, he tells us specifically why he teaches us this parable. He's teaching this parable because the Pharisees and the tax collectors are grumbling about Jesus hanging out with sinners and tax collectors. So this is a part of the same parable. It's part of the same stories where Jesus is addressing this issue. Now, with this parable, the main focus in this parable is going to be on the Father. The Father is what this parable is about. And we know that because that's what the first line of the parable tells us. Jesus continued. He says, there was a man who had 2 sons. So what's this parable about? It's about a man that had 2 sons. It's about the man. It's about the Father. Now, this parable, like most all the other parables, they mainly are going to teach a single point. All right? And there can be some sub-points in the parable. And we got to distinguish between what the meaning of the parable is and what a potential, maybe a preaching point would be in a parable. Okay? This parable is one of Jesus' most famous parables. There's books about it, there's paintings about it, there's stories about it, there's all these different things about it. And there's different emphasis that you can preach in this passage here, depending on what point you want to draw out. Those things are legitimate. So what I'm telling you guys is when you read a passage and we found out what that passage specifically means, there are other things that you can take from it, knowing that they are a subset of the parable. So you can take this parable and use it to preach certain points and draw those points out by using this parable, even though the parable isn't initially for that specific purpose. You understand? So we got the parable, we got this guy, the Father is what this parable is about, because that's what the parable tells us is about. And then you have the 2 sons. Okay? Well, I'm sure you guys have all heard this story preached from just about every angle in this parable. From the point of the prodigal son, from the point of the son that is left behind and stays at home, the faithful son, from the point of the Father. All those things are legitimate, but the story itself is about the Father and the joy in finding that which was lost. You guys understand that? Mm-hmm. So, you guys know this parable. There was a man that had 2 sons, and the younger son, he wanted to get his inheritance now, so he asked his father to divide up his inheritance and give it to him. And the father did. Well, then the son goes off into a far country and he wastes his money on prodigal living. And when he starts to get in want or runs out of money, there's a famine in the land. He hires himself out to one of the locals to feed the guy's pigs. And the son is so hungry, he wishes that he could just eat the pods that were given to the pigs. But then he comes to himself and he says, I know what I'll do. I'm going to go back home because my father's servants, they have plenty of bread to eat. They're not starving. His servants are living better than I am now. So I'm going to go back home and I'm going to tell my father. He rehearses the story in his mind before he gets there about how he's going to tell his father that he has sinned against heaven and against his father, and he's not worthy to be called a son anymore. Make me a servant, but take me back. But we know that while the kid is coming back home and he's still a long way off, the father sees him and he runs to the son and he hugs him and kisses him, and the younger son starts to rehearse his repentance speech that he had already thought out. So he starts to tell his dad how sorry he is and that he sinned against heaven and against his father, and his dad kind of just cuts him off and interrupts him and tells his servants to put a ring on his finger, put a robe on him, and kill the fatted calf, and let's have a party. Okay? So when he does that, the older son is coming in from the field, and he wants to know what's going on. He hears all this music and partying and stuff like that. So he wants to know what's going on. He calls one of the servants to him, one of his dad's servants, says, what's going on? The servant tells him that your dad's killed a fatted calf, your brother's home, and we're having a party. Well, the older son, he won't go into the party. He's mad. He's mad, and his dad finds out about it and goes out to talk to him about this. Well, he tells his dad that, look, I've been with you all this time and all these years, and you've never even given me so much as a goat to have a party with my friends. And now this son has come home that has wasted all of your property, and now you give him the fatted calf, which would be the special animal for this party. And so he's mad about it. And the father says to the older son he says, son, everything that I have is yours. He said, you've always been with me. You will always be with me. But it was proper for us to rejoice because your brother was dead. Now he's alive. He's come home. So you should rejoice as well. Now we don't know at the end of the story whether the older son changes his mind or not. But you can see the point of the story is the father's response to the prodigal son. The dad is not worried at all about what this son has done or what he has done with the father's property or how he has lived or what sins he has committed. The point is he's home now. And this shows us the father's, what Jesus is trying to teach these Pharisees and the tax collectors is that's how God sees these sinners. The point is they're coming back to him. Remember, this is what the whole Old Testament is about. This is what all the prophets came for. This is what we read about in the Psalms. The whole point is to get people to turn back to God. No matter how far away they went or whatever they have done, God sends his prophets to his people to turn them back to him. Come back home. Come back to me, and I will heal you. And that's what redemptive history is about. And these Pharisees and the tax collectors, if they loved God and knew God, they would be about what God is about. God is about restoring sinners to himself. He's not concerned with all this stuff in the past. He sees it, he knows it. The most important thing is that they turn to him. So this story is about the father and the father's response. He's overjoyed. He doesn't shake his finger at the prodigal son about, give me an account of everything that you've done, and you shouldn't have done that, and I told you so, and all this kind of stuff. That's not what he says. He welcomes him home and he honors him. Not only does he honor him, but he throws him a party, which is astounding after what this kid has done with his father's property. But that's how God is. That's how God sees these sinners, and that's how these tax collectors and Pharisees should see the people. This is why Jesus is doing what he's doing, because this is the Father's response and Father's reaction to sinners. Therefore, that's Jesus' response to sinners. That's why Jesus is preaching the Word of God to these people, to turn them back to himself. So you have the Son The second emphasis in this parable is going to be on the older brother. Remember, he's talking to the Pharisees and the tax collectors. That's the reason why this story is in here. So he's gently but pointing out what they look like and what they look like to God. And you'll notice in this parable here, the father is even kind and merciful and loving to the older son. He's patient with the older son because he realizes that the older son has been with him all these years and has been doing what he's supposed to be doing and hasn't done all the prodigal stuff. But he's reminding this older son that, look, my love, my grace, and my mercy to the younger son doesn't diminish my love for you. Okay? So you are mine and you will always be mine, and everything I have belongs to you. But we need to rejoice because we're all about restoring people to God. And so the point of the story is Jesus is implicitly telling these people, don't be like the older brother. You should rejoice because your Father rejoices over restoration of sinners. Okay, now we're in Luke chapter 16, verse 1. And these next couple parables are going to address the issue of our view or use of material goods in the world. Okay? So, in my Bible, this is called the parable of the dishonest manager. And it's an interesting parable, and a little bit of background, cultural information will help us to understand this parable a lot more. So in this parable, you have a guy that's managing somebody else's property. All right? So this wouldn't have been like the lead servant in a household that gives the food at the proper times to the servants. This guy would have been somebody that was would act in place of the owner of the property. So this guy was somebody that had a lot of estates, the guy that owns his property. And so maybe he has a country estate or something like that, and he goes, this is one of his houses or one of his properties, and the owner actually lives in a different country or further away. Okay? So what this manager has the responsibility of doing is acting on the owner's behalf. So this guy can make contracts for the owner. He could lease out his property. He could make contracts and deals for this owner. So he can act as the owner, binding him to contracts, hiring out his property, selling and buying his property for the owner. So this guy has a lot of authority. So the owner gets wind that this manager is misusing his funds, misusing his property. So the owner calls him in and he says, I've been hearing that you've been abusing your responsibilities, mismanaging my property. So you can no longer be the manager of my property. Basically, this guy's getting fired. And so he doesn't know what he's going to do. The manager of the property. He says, I'm not strong enough to dig a ditch. Basically, he's saying, I'm not strong enough for manual labor, and I'm too proud to beg. What am I going to do? So he thinks to himself, and he says, I know what I'll do. So he calls in the debtors, the people that owe his boss money, his master debtors. And the first one he asks, how much do you owe my master? And the guy says, 800 gallons of olive oil. The manager told him, take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 400. And then he asks a second, how much do you owe my manager, my master? He said, 1,000 bushels of wheat. He told him, take your bill and make it 800. And then the master, the owner of everything, the master commended the dishonest manager because he acted shrewdly. And then Jesus tells us, for the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light. I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourself so that when it is gone, you will be welcome into eternal dwellings. Now, that can be a little bit hard for us to understand, but to know what's going on here, first you got to understand, why is this guy called a dishonest manager? The reason why he's called a dishonest manager is because he squandered his master's property at first. So he was mismanaging this guy's property. That's the reason why he got fired. He's not called a dishonest manager because he sat down and cooked the books for taking what was owed his master and cut it in half or cut it by a third. That's not the reason why he's dishonest. And what he did was not dishonest, and I'll tell you why. Well, as part of this normal business practice for an agency like this, okay, when a manager like this would make deals or manage the property of another, what typically would happen is he would charge commission for lending out property or selling this, like the 800 gallons of olive oil or the wheat or stuff like that. Okay? So what you see being shaved off of this bill is a commission. The manager's commission is what he's shaving off. And sometimes this is viewed as, there were laws in the Old Testament about usury or excessive interest. So you couldn't charge excessive interest on goods. It was against the law, right? The way they got around that is they just upped the price. So if you have a good that's extremely perishable, the interest or the built-in interest will be 100%. Something that is extremely perishable. Okay, so that's how these managers would make more money managing somebody else's property. You guys understand that? So what he's cutting here is not money actually owed to the master. What he's cutting is his commission off of every one of these transactions. Okay? So that's why, and so what the parable is teaching us is this guy knew that he was getting fired. And this is a crisis moment for this manager. Okay? So he figures out how to use what he does have for the future or for this crisis moment. And then Jesus tells us the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than the people of the light, or Christians, what we would think of as Christians. So, and with us, what Jesus is trying to get us to keep in mind is the crisis moment for us is judgment, or the end times, or, you know, when Jesus shows back up. That's the crisis moment. So we should manage our worldly goods in a way that is beneficial to us eternally. Okay? Jesus tells us, he's going to tell us in a few more parables about there are consequences eternally about how we use our worldly goods now. See, everything this guy had was owned by another. Okay? And so the obvious parallel to us is everything we have belongs to another. We are stewards or managers of God's stuff. Okay? So we should handle our property in light of eternity, in light of the crisis that's coming, in light of judgment that's coming. That's how, because we have a different perspective than the world does. Okay? So we don't hoard stuff is basically what he's saying. Because you're going to have to give an account for the way you handle your stuff. And God's not opposed to you enjoying the stuff for blessings that he's given to you. But first things first, you know, manage it in light of eternity. Okay, so he goes on to say that, you know, whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much. Whoever is dishonest with little will be dishonest with much. And obviously, he's talking about if you can't handle worldly goods, then heavenly riches you will not be able to handle at all. These are little things. The things of this world, the material possession of this world, those are little things. It doesn't matter if you're, a millionaire, a billionaire, or even more. That's trivial compared to the things of eternity. So, let's go to Luke chapter 16, verse 14. And Jesus is telling them about this dishonest manager. They pick up on what he's saying. The Pharisees, who loved money, heard all this and were sneering at Jesus. And he said to them, "You're the ones who justify yourselves in the eyes of men, but God knows your hearts. What is highly valued among men is detestable in God's sight." So Luke tells us that the Pharisees who loved money, they didn't like this teaching about money from Jesus. And he says, "You're the ones who justify yourself," meaning and these guys walked around and a lot of them were rich, and they could say, "See how God has blessed me because I'm rich." And then they would take their worldly goods and show how rich they were. Okay, they would have the best roads. They would drive the fastest chariots. They would walk around all puffed up saying, "Look how blessed I am. God loves me and I'm righteous. That's why he's giving me all this stuff." And it would just inflate their ego. So they justified themselves in the eyes of men. So people would look at them and say, "Wow, they must be really righteous. God must really, really love them, because look at their life. Look at what they're wearing. Look at what they're driving. So they must be righteous." So you see, they were using their worldly goods to pump up their false righteousness. And Jesus says, God sees your heart. He's not impressed by this stuff. So what's highly valued among men is detestable in God's sight.